I'm Miranda from Miranda Rose Studio, and I'm a working designer in New York City, and today we're going to be sewing up the Reverie top. So this top has two views. View A has this inset panel. I made mine out of lace, but yours can be whatever fabric you want. It doesn't have to be sheer. View B has that panel filled in. Both have this lovely scooped back with shirring at the back. It's a little bit longer than the front, so you have a nice, airy feel. It's still a little bit too cold to wear it here, but soon. All right, let's get started. First, you'll need your Reverie top pattern. The link is in the description below. If you're printing letter format or A4 format, you'll need to assemble your pattern. The booklet comes with a print layout guide showing you how to arrange the papers depending on the format that you're using. Align the papers edge to edge. Don't trim or overlap the pages. Use the diamonds to help align the pages. I find it helpful to tape the edges of the paper first while keeping the middle of the page weighed down with a pattern weight. View A. Prep pattern pieces. Fuse your interfacing to the front and back face pieces. In order to reduce bulk, I like to trim 1/8 of an inch from the edges of the interfacing that will be caught in a seam. Serge the bottom edges of your front and back facing pieces. Serge the two rounded sides of your yoke and yoke lining. Stay stitch the curved edges of the front and back facing pieces at 3/8 of an inch. All steps remain the same as view A, except that your front bodice and front facing pieces will look slightly different. Serge the entire bottom of the facing. Stay stitch the back bodice piece at the armholes and from the gathering notch up into the shoulder at 3/8 of an inch. Stay stitch the armholes of the front bodice piece at 3/8 of an inch. Right side to right side, sew the front bodice and back bodice together at the side seams using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Serge and then press to the back. Right side to right side, sew the front facing and back facing together at the side seams using the same 1/2 inch seam allowance. Serge and press to the front. On the front bodice piece, sew 2 basting stitches at 1/8 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch from the shoulder to the gathering notch. Gently pull the threads to gather the fabric until it matches to the measurement of the front facing piece up into the gathering notch. On the front bodice piece, sew 2 basting stitches at 1/8 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch between the 2 gathering notches. Gently pull the threads to gather the fabric until it matches to the front facing piece. Right side to right side, match the corners of one side of the front yoke piece to one side of the front bodice piece and pin. Then pin at the gathering notch. Do the same on the other side, making sure that the gathering remains evenly distributed. Sew at 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you approach the point, turn your hand wheel until you have your needle sunk into the point exactly, then pivot before continuing to stitch. Be careful to keep the area you're stitching flat to avoid tucks. Trim down the seam allowance to 3/8 of an inch, then snip right at the center front where your point is. Grade the corner. Snip small triangles in the rest of the seam allowance to reduce bulk. Fold your strap right side to right side, then sew down the edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I don't like to trim the seam allowance down because I find the full seam allowance makes the strap more substantial and gives it more of a luxurious feel. Using a tube turner, or your preferred method, turn your straps right side out. Press flat. Sew the front facings to the yoke lining, serge, and then fold that seam allowance away from the center and top stitch at 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch. Press. Sew 2 basting stitches at 1/8 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch between the back gathering notches and pull the threads until the area fits between the 2 gathering notches on the back facing. Tie off. Pin the back bodice to the back facing, making sure the center back notches are aligned and that shirring is evenly distributed. Stitch the center back at 1/2 of an inch from shoulder to shoulder. Clip into the seam, understitch the seam allowance to the lining 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch from the seam. Pin the remaining neckline of the facing to the bodice, making sure that the center front and side seams of each are aligned. Sandwich the straps between the front bodice and front bodice facing. Place them 1/2 an inch from the edges of the neckline so they won't get caught in the armhole seam allowance. Sew all around at 1/2 an inch seam allowance. I recommend sewing over the straps twice or 3 times to keep them stable. The seam allowance of the yoke and the gathered bodice should be facing down. Clip all curves and understitch the seam allowance to the facing at 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch, as far as you can get it. Pin the remaining neckline of the facing to the bodice, making sure that the center front and side seams of each are aligned. Sandwich the straps between the front bodice and front bodice facing. Place them 1/2 an inch from the edges of the neckline so they won't get caught in the armhole seam allowance. Sew all around at 1/2 an inch seam allowance. I recommend sewing over the straps twice or 3 times to keep them stable. Clip all curves and understitch the seam allowance to the facing at 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch, as far as you can get it. Blind stitch the yoke lining to the front bodice, catching the seam allowance from the yoke and the front bodice inside. Insert straps into the openings on the back bodice. You may need a pin or your tube turner to pull the strap through so the edges of the strap and the openings are aligned. Sew across at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Sew over it again for stability. Grade the corners and trim down the strap seam allowance to reduce bulk. Press and tie your neckline. Flip inside out and then press again. Sew the facings to the side seams by stitching in the ditch from the right side of the bodice. Complete the hem by folding it up 1/4 of an inch and then 1/4 of an inch again so the raw edge is hidden. It can help to sew a 1/4 inch guideline all around the hem and use that to make your first fold. Stitch all around your hem at 1/8 of an inch and then press until the hem lays flat. Put the top on, take the front strap and loop it around like you're tying your shoelaces. Pull until you form a bow. Play with it until you like the size and shape and the front and back straps lay flat against your body. My bow is 4.5 inches wide for reference. Tack the bow so it stays tied permanently. Stab your needle through the bow knot and stitch it through a few times. Tie off. Mark how long you'd like the straps to be. Leave 1/2 inch seam allowance below this mark and cut the rest off. If you like the length of the ties on my top, leave the straps the length that I patterned and hem them without cutting any excess off. Fold the seam allowance inside the tube and top stitch shut at 1/8 of an inch. Press. Okay, now that we've sewn up our Reverie top, reminder that this pattern will be 30% off for the next 72 hours. The link will be in the description. Stay tuned for more. I'm so excited to finally start this.